All right. In this share, we're going to continue discussing the Yanim that are Shayach to Hilchas Nida, even if they aren't necessarily the exact halachas you've been learning throughout the week. But this time, we could perhaps characterize that this share will be particularly, quote-unquote, provocative. Now, usually, in a regular share, I try to find Makaitis, Paiskim, Meida Hira, and try to explain what they say and why we should follow what they say. But in this particular share, I'm here to, quote-unquote, expose, unmask a scandal, according to which it's possible that the wider public is not being mekayim halachas and vestos properly. Okay, I hope I have your attention now. And these are the halachas that, quote unquote, they don't want you to know. Right? Now, as we'll see, though, it actually is due to the influence of a number of chashava gedolei hira. So that's why I would like to emphasize, before I continue, that this is all being said with tremendous derech eretz, and this discussion is only l'pulpula, shakta bataria, and the lay basi el lo'eder. So we're going to go over the topic, and I'm going to quote what I heard in the name of these different meida hira. Now I'll say what I think. And I hope at the least will at least be ma'oder, drive a active conversation, discussion, shaklavataria within the Kolel and even beyond. And of course, everyone will ultimately follow the psak of their Rav. I also like to thank a few of the chashvi and galai here in the Kolel who are more familiar with the halachas of the nida and hira and shimush, and I was discussing some of these details with them in the days preceding this year. I'd also like to thank someone from out of the Kolel who prefers his name not be mentioned, who I also was in touch with a lot about various details, and he sent me a very lengthy piece of his research on it. But of course, he doesn't necessarily share or take responsibility for my conclusions. So when we think about the word vestos, in light of what we learned, what we were taught, so we immediately think, of course, of vestos hayomim, marking down days, calendars. And as if that's how halach is based on the idea that there's some kind of rhythm, pattern of involving time. But it's interesting to know that if you look in the Makar and Mishnayos, it doesn't seem that way. In Perek Aleph, at the beginning it says, Kol isha sheyesh levesas daya shata. Okay, if she has a vesas, then that's all you need to know, but doesn't explain. Then in Perek Tes, where it seems to be setting out to explain, the Mishnah says, Kol isha sheyesh levesas daya shaita, same phrase again. Ve'elu heina vestos. What are the vestos? The Mishnah says, B'fahekes, u'me'ateshes, v'chisheshes, b'fikresa, b'shipule me'eha, b'shefas, u'cheminz marmoides, oiches en oisa, v'chein kayetze behen. She yawns, she sneezes, depending on how you touch me'ateshes. She senses pain near her stomach or in her lower abdomen, or there's some kind of discharge, or there's some kind of fever or shuddering that overtakes her, and anything else like that. Those are the vestos. And if this happens 3 times, that's what the Mishnah says. And this is what is known in halacha, in the later Sfarim, as a vestos haguf. And I would have very much have liked to have taken a survey before the shir to know how many people could have told me that they heard of a vestos haguf and they know what it is and they can describe it. I assume that some yes and some no. And of course, the general description that we've said so far sounds pretty on the ball, sounds pretty relevant to our experiences today, how women today describe the feeling, the sensation that they get. Then in Mishnah Tes, after some additional pratim in the middle, it says, it sounds like that we're now introducing a secondary category is also vestos hayom. Now, it's not actually how the Gemara seems to explain it. The Gemara says that really that line in Perek Aleph was already referring to vestos hayom, and now we got to explaining vestos haguf. I'm not coming here to explain the Mishnayos and the Gemara, but at least that's the impression you would get from Mishnayos. Of course, this is the first makar. Let's advance to Tur and Shulchan Aruch. So in Tur, Siman Kuf Pedal, which we're learning now. So it starts, Reiv Hanoshim Yesh lahan vestos lidus b'zman yadua kol achas lefi zmano ustam vestos mishleishim yoyim l'shleishim yoyim. So everyone learning it, I assume, is thinking about it and wondering, how does this actually match the reality that we're familiar with? So in an article that was published in the annual scholarly volume called Tchumen, which has different contributors, and we'll get back to it later at greater length. So among other things, they point out that the Torah, Taka writes it this way, but you shouldn't get the impression that that's representative of all Rishonim even at that time. So for example, there's a Sefer Oyel Moed, one of the Rishonim, Shmuel Yerondi. He wrote it mamish around the same time as the Torah, which is probably why most people have never heard of it, because it was overshadowed by the Torah. And he starts Oyel Moed Shara Isser V'Heter Derech Yirav like this: B'Nashim Yesh Shalosh Midas. There's 3 traits in women. Number 1, Yesh She'ein Lo Vesas Klal. That's category number 1. A woman who does not have a vesas. Sounds perhaps there's a kavana in the order that he's saying it. The number 1 is no vesas. She doesn't see b'yom kavu and she doesn't feel anything. The blood just shows up. Number 2, Yesh Isha Sheyesh Lo Vesas Haguf. She feels when the blood is about to come. She feels something. B'fehekes, mateshas, etc. Number 3, Yesh Isha Sheyesh Lo Vesas Hayamim. Yom Kavu L'Riyasa. Very different presentation. Also, Nagoy's Shari Dura, an Ashkenazi Sefer, an Ashkenazi Chibur. So, in Nagoy's Shari Dura, Nida Siman Zayin, it starts off, Kol HaNoshim Shalonu, Afal Pi She'ein L'Kulon, Vestis D'Yomim, Yesh L'Kulon, Vestis D'Gufa. Even though not all have the Yomim, they all have the Gufa. Now, for some reason, the way it's printed, the words D'Yomim, Yesh L'Kulon, Vestis are in brackets, so I'm not sure. I'm assuming and hoping that whoever put it there didn't just put it in their misvara. I'm not sure why it's in brackets. I have to say that, but that's what it seems to say. And then he goes on to say, "Hekas matashas," goes through the different symptoms, and he adds that if they passed and she didn't do a badika, even if they did a badika later, a little too late, Tmeya. We assume that Ataka did happen at that time, and we'll get back to this halacha practically more towards the end. So not only did they not assert that all women have vesas hayamim, but in fact they emphasized the vesas haguf. So, back to the turn Shulchan Aruch, you look in Siman Kuf Peitas and Hilchas Vestas, so if you manage to traverse and get through the part that talks about the vestas hayamim, so then when you get to make it to Sif Yates, so from Yates to Chavav, you have the halachas of vestas haguf and Shulchan Aruch standards rather in detail. It starts off Yesh Kavaz Vesas Eidei Mikrim Sheyeru Begufa Goyin Shemefahekas, which is either stretching or yawning or making a noise. Misateshas the Shulchan Aruch teaches Derech Mata, or feels pain, befi kreisa, shipulmea, stomach, the abdomen, or tziriya kadachas, feverish, or reisha ve'verak ve'dam alaha, any one of these. So if any of these happen 3 times and she saw dam, kavala veses, so the Shulchan Aruch mentions, what does it mean she has a veses? Shebachol pam, she chesheshes mehem, when that symptom recurs, asur l'shamish, so then you know that it's like inside of a day, it's a feeling. But of course, with pashtos, at least one assumes with pashtos, it also works the other way. That if she has if she has a vesas gavua for days, so then that means you can forget about all the other chashashas. It's not a suffix. It's clear that the same thing applies here. Vesas gavua kishmei keinhu. That if you have a vesas gavua of the feeling, the sensation of the symptoms, so then it's mevatel all the chashashas of the days. Was over there, we have a chazaka that it comes on a certain day, we don't have to be cheshish for other days. And here we have a chazaka that never comes without that sensation. So until she feels something, until she senses something, there's no chash. So there's a chumrah here, and there's a kula here. So, yeah. So this is one of the dinim that affect how one practices the halachas of nida properly. And we'll get back to this point later. Now, of course, as we know, like in every halacha in Hilchos Nida, there are many detailed discussions about the details in the halacha and the Nesekelim and the Achrayim and the Malaktim. But so far from what we heard, the descriptions in the Mishnah and the Shulchan Aruch, they all sound pretty familiar. They sound recognizable. And it wouldn't occur to us to think otherwise. Okay, so what's the next step? The next step would be to look in the practical Sfarim that we have today. So in our case, Yungalite, Chabad, Learn Hilchos Nida Lamaisa, they usually are the first sefer they'll look in is in the sefer Tara Kalacha of Rabbi Gasil Farkash. Okay, so you open the sefer, Chelek Beis, Perek Chav Daled, Hilchos Vestos. You'll turn the pages, you look from beginning to end, you won't find any halachas of Vestos Haguf in Perek Chav Daled. Instead, if you look at the beginning of the Perek, page 589, there are four havharas, four clarifications. Clarification number 3 says, in this Perek, we only address vestos that are tied to time, the date, the number of days. Le'idach gis in Shulchan Aruch and Siman Kuf Pei Tes from Yud Zayin to Chav Zayin, and also the last sif of Kuf Pei Daled, which we'll get to soon. There are the din of additional categories. One is vestos hakfitzos, which is not the subject of our discussion. He writes, vestos haguf, loy biyarnu chashoshes elu b'sefreinu, mekivan she'einam shchichim kol kach. We're not going to explain it in the sefer because they're not common. If in a case where it seems like there's some siba chitzainis or physiological phenomena, you should speak to Rav Meir Hira about whether there's any halachic significance. So, just like that, asking that it's not common, and therefore, essentially, skip the entire thing. There's one footnote somewhere else which mentions Vestos Haguf, B'negei, someone who stains, but that's it. Now, of course, it goes without saying, we have tremendous derech for Rav Farkash, and of course, he and his family are friends of the Kolel, supporters of the Kolel. He gave a shiur here last year. But kachi darka shel Torah, that even the ketanim can be done b'fnei agdolim, and at least ask a question. And as I said earlier, and we'll speak about it later, these are things, as far as I know, as far as anyone I know knows, these are things that any woman could easily describe and identify in her life. But this he didn't even find it necessary to list, to discuss, to detail. Mashenkin dini hargasha, which generally the assumption is that women don't understand what we're talking about, as I assume you've already seen and you're learning, and of course that's its own discussion and what women really do or don't feel. But that he has, in detail at the beginning of the sefer, right in the beginning, what's going on. Let's go to the next sefer. What's the other common sefer that people use, even if it's much shorter? Of course, Kitzer Dinei Tara. So the first time I picked it up now to look at it, I went through it and it seemed like it's also completely gone, not a trace. Then right before the shiur, I looked again and I noticed that at the end of Siman Ches, which is about Vestos, in Eis Tazayin, page 32, this is what it says. There are a number of additional categories of Vestos which aren't so common, but if they're nikba, then you have to be chayshish. Vestos Hadilug devotes 5 lines to that. Vestos Hasirug devotes 2 lines to that. Oy, Vestos Haguf shiragila b'michushim im hareiyah kegoyin ke'evroish v'habeten eichoim b'chayetze b'zeh. 1 line. In all these cases, there are many chalukei din. If it's a vestos gevur or it's not, chumra l'kula. So therefore, the woman has to mark down all the time she saw, and if there's a chash that she has one of these vestos, she should ask Rav Meir Hira. So you could almost miss it, but they slipped in 1 line in the middle of the paragraph at the end of the siman. That, by the way, something. Now, l'chayra, from the continuation, actually it does sound like it's saying that a woman should write everything down. On the other hand, the lashon is she should write kol hazmanim shirasa. So it sounds more like it's referring to vestos hadilug v'hasirug, where there's actually times, zmanim shirasa. Otherwise, in this case, you're not writing down zmanim shirasa per se, you're writing zmanim shirgisha, no? What and when she felt it. So that's all you get from Kitzer Dinei Tara. So it's forgivable that if we have younger light here, that maybe Taka don't remember, that they don't seem to recall they ever heard of it, or at least never practiced it. On the other hand, seems from all the evidence, it seems like something's up. If we're seeing a pattern of omitting it, so maybe without us realizing, some consensus has been reached that it's not relevant for some reason in halacha today, or maybe at least in Chabad. But that's also not quite the case. Because if you look at other svarim nowadays, of course you have to know that there's a real ton of svarim on these subjects. Many of them are fairly chashuv, or the authors are often famous poskim. Some are more le'iyun, some are more lemaisa. And it's kedai in the course of your learning to acquaint yourself with a wider range of them. You'll find that in the average Taras HaMishpacha, Hilchos Nida Sefer out there, especially outside Chabad, you'll find these halachas are enumerated exactly in identical fashion to all the other dinim. Most of them don't necessarily mamish get into how common it is or isn't. But it sounds like it's certainly among the halachas that one has to know and one has to perform. And from different details in their descriptions, it certainly sounds like they're describing the reality as it's known today. And it sounds like it's a regular din and halacha, reality, being mekayim the halacha. So, for example, as an example of a practical and very widespread sefer nowadays, I'll use Art Scroll. We have Pischei Halacha, the laws of Nida, the Yom First, page 338 and on. So if you look here, right. Introduction. Most women experience a physical sensation before the onset of their menstruation. Often this sensation is not unique to the onset of menstruation, but may occur at other occasions unrelated to menstruation. In this case, the sensation is not vestos haguf. They actually write vest haguf, because apparently, as we saw today from our visitor, our new member of the faculty, apparently they say vest. I think we all say vestos, but just interesting to note. So that's how they write it. However, some women experience a very unique physical sensation prior to the menstruation. This is called vestos haguf. Vestos haguf is not a causative vestos, but a symptomatic vestos. It's a symptom, not the cause. We do not know the cause of the flow, but we do know when it is about to begin, as opposed to kfitzis or other things where we believe that it's triggering. It's a very good indicator, is what it is. And at the bottom, they say this is not to be confused with hargasha, which is a separate discussion. Okay, continues the basic halachas of a vestos haguf. What constitutes a vestos haguf? The sensations that are considered vestos haguf. Among the sensations enumerated by Chazal as vestos haguf are women who experience a stretching or yawning spell, pihuk, goisa, a belching spell, a sneezing spell, itush, or a spell of flatulence, depending how you explain itush. More common today are other symptoms. Some also noted by Chazal. And right at the bottom, it would seem that any unusual physical manifestation is considered a vestos haguf, even if it is not noted by Chazal. So if you can come up with something new, that's also fine. But the ones they're going to list are mentioned in Chazal. Many women feel aches or cramps in the stomach, the lower abdomen, or limbs, headaches, hot flashes, a shivering spell, or nausea, a woman can also get a vestos haguf if she usually finds stains before menstruation. That discussion. These symptoms may be a sign that the period is about to begin and may be considered a vestos haguf. For the sake of simplicity, we will use the examples of cramps when discussing a vestos haguf in this chapter, since it is common for women to experience cramps before menstruation. Only if it's 3 times, etc. It gets into all they have to be unusual. So the headache itself has to be an unusual headache that only occurs in relation to this. It has to be unusual cramps. The sneezing has to be an extended fit, but that gives you a sense of. It sounds very relevant, very practical, very much in touch with the terminology of today. That's how the Sefer writes it. It's right there. Of course, it goes on over many pages to explain all the details of how to implement it. Right? Of course. The question will always be, will you actually get a vestos kavur or not? But overall, it sounds very much familiar. And that's just representative of most svarim today. Moreover, a Gedaliah Oberlander, who we had the privilege, came this past year to Faher the Ingelader in Mekavois, and he's a big expert in various practical matters of halacha. So when it comes to Hilchos Nida, he partnered with a Rav. His name is Rav Moshe Eliezer Blum, based in of Siksa. Did not have a chance to figure out where Siksa is, but they wrote many stuff lemaisa on these topics. Rabbi Shraga told me that he understands that they came from the angle of taking pills, etc., and how that impacts the halachas today. But anyway, so they published in the Gillion of Kovetz Ginas V'Rodim. Kovetz Ginas V'Radam is a Satmar Torah Kovetz. Here in the Kolel, we quote from all kinds of places. At the beginning, just to give you a sense, taste, at the beginning of each Gillion of Kovetz Ginas V'Radam, there's a warning from the Marachas. Lehav Yadua, ki kol ma'amorim tzrichim liyas kasuv, ach v'rak, b'safa bruro v'n'ima, b'svas lashon ha'kodesh, lei b'svas ilgim, ivris, hamuduberes ha'yidei ha'tziyayim. So that's the kind of kovetz we have. And in this kovetz, in Gillion number 22, in Tafshin Ayin Daled, they have an article there called Bitter Dinoi Vestos Haguf Bizmanenu. And at the beginning, I'd like to thank one of the Galai who pointed it out to me. There's a Hakdama there that says, Roy Reisi, to explain, this is an important matter in Hilchos Vestos, to explain Dinoi Hilchos Vestos Haguf, Bekitzer, because I saw some Malakti Hilchos Nida and many Magidi Shiurim didn't learn and didn't write these dinim with the excuse that it's not negei bizmanenu, but mitoich nisayin, from experience we see shezeh einai, this is incorrect. V'harbe nashim yesh lehen simoni aguf kodim riyasan ella shlei samu liban lazeh. No one's paying attention to it because no one taught them the halacha. So it's a very virtuous cycle. One leads to the next and back around again. So therefore, we're going to be mevar these dinim as far as we can. Halacha v'lei lamaisa. Everyone speak to your Rav, and they go on for 11 pages to explain the practical details. And they start off Isha as a vestos haguf, which means she never sees her vestos until she feels something. What could it be? Mefahakas, and they go through the list and the way they touch. They mention b'fikresa u'b'shipulim me'ehal kagoyin krampen, right? Just to use the contemporary term. And then they mention other things. If she sees secretions, other iyas tahiris, like shefas in the Mishnah, or nausea, or stomach is turning, etc. Different makaidas for different simanim. And even other things like women that break out in pimples, acne, tzom, bues, alpneim, which is a very modern siman, but a number of svarim in the last 10-15 years have started mentioning it. But that's how they begin. Again, then they repeat themselves. There's they then afterwards Tafshin Ches, they put out the Sefer Klali Tara. We have it here in Kolel, and from over many more pages they go through all the pratim. Look in Sefer Shiur Shevet Halevi, who was one of the great poskim of the previous generation, of the last generation, passed away a few years ago, and he was had a strong impact on a large portion of the Mordei Hira of the following generations. So when he gets to these seifim, goes kedarkai, style of the sefer, which is a little iyondik, and numerous times throughout his words, it sounds like it's common, lamaisa. So, for example, he writes, Nashim rabbis that have simoni haguf a few days before the vestos. Now, if we follow, he's discussing Lechem B'Simla. Lechem B'Simla wrote that if she has a combination of yomim and mikrim, which is another idea in halacha where it's a combination, it comes at a certain interval. Plus, there's always the sensation. So, you're going to tell me that if the sensation comes 2 days before the day she's expecting, she should be mutter l'shamish b'li lachish klau? Maybe the sensation coming 2 days earlier means that this month everything moved over by 2 days. So according to the Lechem B'Simla, even if you always know like a clock, the pain starts, 2 days later it comes. Lechem B'Simla was suggesting that you should be also the entire time because every minute that it's here, maybe everything has moved up. So Shiur Shevet Halevi says, what if it happens 10 days? Sometimes it happens 10 days before she feels cramps, 12 days before, you knock out the whole month like that. So the Shiur Shevet Halevi says it could be he's not only being machmir when there's days and sensations. And now the sensations came early. So now Taka feels like, things changed. But if they always come 2 days before, which is not what Lechem B'Simla was talking about, as he suggests, so then it's fine. They always come 2 days before, so you always know at the end of the 2 days we'll have the done. So he starts off. He said, "It sounds like he's talking about women today. Later on, he writes, there are some women that don't feel simoni haguf. They just have an overall sensation. They feel it's on the way. He says, should be machmir if she feels that, of course. And of course, everyone, even those who don't write about vestos haguf at all, everyone understands you have to use your seichel. If a woman says she feels something, then you don't just ignore it. So he says you should be machmer, but it's not simone haguf. He says also if they have other things that are not mentioned in the mechaber, if they always come consistently, the Shiur Levi also agrees that the kviyas is a kviyas. Doesn't matter if it has a makar in svarim or not. And he's mitzayin to a tshuva of his in Chela Gimel where he wrote this at great length. And the maskana was that even though if it always comes a few days early, you only have to be chayshish at the end, but she should still check herself before tashmish during those days in the middle and treat it like she doesn't have a vestos kavua, even if technically halacha doesn't say that. And then the Shiur Levi says, by the way, there are some monim that are not introduction to the vestos. They're not part of the vestos. It's just nervin, person's nervous or whatever. That, of course, you can ignore. So it's being all written in that vein. Sounds like the Shiur Levi is relating to this like a regular din from the Metzias that we know. And if you want to see an even longer list of svarim that addresses and discuss this, there's a big country that's called Derek Malaktim. It's an Eitzar Chachma. I also have a link to Google Drive. I would like to share it with you at some point soon. It really goes through every tag of everything the poskim say on any topic, down to the last malaktim of our dar. He's like a malakat of malaktim. And you can get a sense of how the dimensions of this discussion in a practical way. And Jan Rabbi Oberlander within Chabad, who should be counted among Rabbi Chabad, my friend pointed out to me that he checked on my behalf. He says in Chaysin Yeshuas for Dovid, he makes sure to speak about it. Chaim Prusik for Chabad has Mayim Chaim. It's a very kitzer book, but he does make sure to mention it, even though it's bekitzer, but it's the whole sefer is bekitzer. Oberlander, and so you can't actually even say that there is at least an official Chabad consensus about it. That's not even true either. So I heard Lamaisa that Rav Heller and Rav Bruin also are of the opinion, and they tell people who ask them that the halacha is not really relevant Lamaisa. All right, so the plot thickens. What's going on? So I try to find out what are the explanations being offered. So I heard a few svaras, and due to COVID for the different rabbanim, because I also want to respond to what I was told. So I'm not going to say who said what, but my impression is that I heard 5 different points. Number one, I heard this Pia Shmua from someone here, that if there's a combination of symptoms, the symptoms have to recur each time in the exact same sequence. If there's any change in the spread of the symptoms, then it doesn't count. Number 2, the second argument I seemed to hear was that the blood has to follow the sensation, the exact same interval, exact same number of minutes. Otherwise, it doesn't count. Third argument I heard was that what women feel during the vestos is no different than what they feel on an everyday. So practically, what's the difference? Number 4, that women, it's just going to drive them crazy. They're going to have demyainus. It's not going to be good. And number 5, that whatever you're going to say, practically, if you did an experiment, you'd find that no woman would ever be kriveya vestos kavua for these symptoms. Those are the 5. So I'm going to try to go through them one by one. So the first 2. Well, then what is it? Maybe to be machmer a little bit. Okay.
If it only happens one time, then it won't be. Then you're not cheshish to the regular vestos.
Maybe next time we should treat it like maybe you should also be cheshish to a little bit, do a bedika or something.
Wait, but what was the fifth one again? What was the fifth one again?
That practically speaking, if you actually ran an experiment, no one would ever get a vestos kavua by recording and tracking this information. Just wouldn't.
The same question. So what's the?
Okay, I'll go through them again and I'll respond to them. So the first 2, that it has to be the exact same sequence, or that it has to be the exact same amount of time, I simply have not found the aside for that, the marker for that. We have many svarim on Nida. Still haven't seen anyone that says that.
They are.
Okay. Interesting.
You haven't seen an article.
Maybe they should put it with fuss, so at least it's on the record, could be discussed. Okay, so that's that. The third one, that there's no difference. I saw some of your reactions. It sounds very surprising to hear that. Anyone can do their own investigation and research, the women that you know, because today, in our world today, it's a rather famous thing. deeply embedded already in the culture and the wider population, that when that time of the month comes, there's a whole bunch of, stuff happens, this terrible pain. As far as I know, women are absolutely able to say that this is different than anything else. Not like a regular stomach ache, which presses on the middle of your stomach. It's lower down. It's a unique feeling. And this is a pretty famous fact. This Rav, this source, quoted a Rav from a previous generation that said that, when the woman does mopping Erev Shabbos, by the time she's finished, so you see, how are you going to know the difference? They feel all the symptoms, you feel them all at all different times. So it's like another description in Sfarim that we don't know about, we can't understand. But what all the other symptoms, if you isolate all the other symptoms, I can understand. Even a regular stomach ache, I can understand. A headache, everything else, maybe it sounds like it happens all the time. But in this response, it almost sounds like they never heard of this concept that there's unique pain during a period, which is a very famous fact. I was thinking, just a theory in the Weltarein, that maybe there's something cultural here at play, because until about 50 years ago, there was very strong etiquette culturally that it was not appropriate to speak about women's health, quote unquote, and how they feel. It wasn't considered something to discuss in polite company, but today it's a grace and mitzvah that everyone speaks about exactly how they feel and when they feel it and all that, and make sure everyone knows. So culture can impact how we perceive feelings, and an example of that I'll mention very bekitzer is colors. We know that thousands of years ago in other cultures, they did not really distinguish between blue and green, and we see in Chazal the word yorik can mean green, and that's kakarsi, or it can mean yellow, kazav, or it can even mean blue. And there's a lot of research been done on the link between language and not having a blue-green distinction and not having that distinction in actual perception. At most, you see it's perceived as slightly different shades of the same color. Someone even mentioned to me here recently that you could even maybe suggest that Benegay and Nida, and maybe once people didn't distinguish so many shades, so it was easier, and then once our seeing became more sophisticated, so that's why we have much more confusion. I didn't check if this svara is angenommen, if it's acceptable or not.
Vision became more sophisticated?
That our vision, meaning what we see now, is quote unquote objectively correct, but there's also a subjective element where if culture doesn't recognize certain distinctions, then you don't perceive them.
Saying that could have been earlier.
So it could be there were times and places where there simply was no recognition of the reality of that there's a unique concept of feeling pain during a period. Maybe they knew that the women complain at different times about not feeling great, but because it wasn't discussed and it wasn't defined, so it was almost like it didn't quite exist, as opposed to today. So maybe that explains where this notion is coming from. But if those who are familiar with the Mitzvah as we know it today, and especially since it mamish fits perfectly with what Chazal say, with what Shulchan Aruch says, how can we accept the svara? And I don't have time. So what about that they're going to have demyonis? So in a chanam, if you're talking about other stuff like headaches, I can see why maybe they'll start getting confused. Although maybe some women will be able to tell you that no, it's not like the art school said they have a unique headache. Maybe not. Maybe they'll get confused. I don't know. But cramps is really where it's at. That seems to be the most unique and then consistent for many women who feel. Could be sometimes women start imagining that the pain is coming because they're imagining that the blood is coming, and I gave like a mushal that sometimes we imagine that we're catching a cold, and then it turns out it's not. It didn't happen. But why does that matter? Ultimately, when it does happen and they feel it for real, then they'll know it was for real, and then they'll have to figure out, was I just imagining it the previous time? Or maybe it actually started a bunch of days early this time and it continued. So, we should try. Let's see if attack causes problems or not. And the last point that the argument that said it's simply not going to happen. So in this article in Tchumen, we don't really have time to get into it, but they claimed that they did a survey with a few hundred women who keep Taras HaMishpacha, and the answers they got was, first they asked them, what's the interval between the pain and the vestos? 2 hours, 6 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours, 3 days, or a week. So 1% said 2 hours, 2.5% said 6 hours, 7% said 12 hours, 19% said 24, within 24 hours, and the rest said even more. So the article says, we take, let's say, within 24 hours, although we saw this firm that say it's absolutely fine if it's 3 days in advance, and Maybe it's always 3 days in advance or whatever. But let's take the ones that are within 24 hours. So you already have the 31% of women. They all sound like they're potential candidates to create a vestos kavua. Then they ask them, how many of you created God a vestos kavua, vestos agof? And women didn't know what they were talking about. Probably weiter, because it's not really taught, it's not really practiced. This is probably a more modern Dati Lumi crowd. Yeah, to whatever extent. It's hard to know who's being taught what. I don't know their background. This isn't necessarily the most scientific study in the world, but it's at least someone tried. So they did a lot of research here. We don't have the time to get into all the details, but I'm happy to share it. If anyone wants to take a look, I'll have to take a look through that. I don't think it's a PDF. I'll have to take pictures of it. So there's this whole article making this argument. I heard that this Rav said he knows about this article in Tchumim, but he thinks it's garnished. Tzarechiyim. Also, even if that's really the only problem, so what's that? Follow the halacha. Halacha is to write everything down, right? And never mind that we have many Sfarim that seem to think that absolutely is b'metzias, and even some people that I spoke to, they said they personally think they know of women that could be kaveh vestos, and we have to emphasize, kaveh vestos doesn't necessarily mean for your entire life, literally like a clock, month in, month out. Just like everything else, maybe 3 times in a row, be kaveh vestos, and don't be like the vestos and kaveh the vestos and the vestos. That's fine. Doesn't have to be all women at all times. So the question is whether all these answers are really getting at something deeper. Are the Rabbanim being cheshish here, that there's some kind of mixture that will come out of it? I don't know. But maybe, if they have a valid concern, then that could be. But based on everything we said, in conclusion, one would think that the application, the website, should add the possibility, add a button to put in the pain, maybe the types of pain or whatever, the time, and that way it could be mekayim instead of erasing a mefurish din, a mishnah, gemara, shulchan aruch, and misvara. It would seem that there surely should be women that will be keveya. What percentage? How often? Who knows? Again, as I said at the beginning of the shir, this is not lemaisa. Everyone should ask their rav and their paisik and follow their instructions. But I do think it's important to raise a discussion about this. A lot of people, even those who learn the halachas, they don't necessarily stop and connect all the dots and put all the pieces together. So I am inviting all of the Ingalite, of course, to look into it. If you, as you're learning, come across details, I'd love to hear creative discussion, and maybe we'll discover that we were actually matzliach to recover a din that was a shtickle meis mitzvah. It's like I said, it's very hard to explain why, at any rate, why we shouldn't be even if nothing happens, why we shouldn't be recording this information unless there's a concern about a michshel. Now, by the way, we don't have time at all to get into it, but there's some pratim that are the unique shittas of the Alter Rebbe. L'mashal, one of the reasons why you would have to do a bedika after this, if it's considered a vestos, a vestos, you have to do a bedika after a vestos. What if you don't do the bedika? So during Malachim, he brings 20 paiskim that say it's really a problem. Happens to be the Alter Rebbe says that if it's a nice while later after the pain, if the pain came and nothing happened, the pain went away, if it's a nice while later, no, it's not so bad. That could also be why the Rabbi Chabad are not as concerned about this. But you're supposed to do a bedika, even according to the Alter Rebbe. Also, the question is it a kula? Will it actually cancel the other days? So, I sort of Yashiv holds and no. Even if you have a vestos kavua, vestos aguf, it's still, you have stuff to keep the whole calendar. But the Alter Rebbe writes pretty clearly, only Eina Beininus. Eina Beininus, yes, not the rest. Abelander write that in his sefer, so that would be the case. And then the Pesach Leo Falk in the sefer Machzor Leo says that there's another vart of the Alter Rebbe. Okay, we're not going to get into it, but there's another kvetch, a diuk that the Alter Rebbe holds differently in the Chavos Das. And in conclusion, I'd be very happy to hear your responses, your reactions, and to hear more opinions of more Rabbanim, more experts of the Shabbos.